So the next session is James E. Rothman session, who received the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 2013 for the discoveries of machinery regulating vesicle traffic, a major transport system in our cells. I would like to introduce our chairpersons for this session. Those are Dr. Mayank M. Shah from Palanpur and Dr. Chitralekha Vora from Ahmedabad. I would request Dr. Chitralekha Vora to please introduce our next speaker.
Good afternoon, everybody. Our next speaker is Dr. Rakesh Sahai from Hyderabad. He is a senior consultant endocrinologist working at Aster Prime Hospital, Hyderabad. And he would be giving his presentation on the musculoskeletal manifestations of diabetes, which is an untouched topic because most of the diabetics know the effects of diabetes on kidneys, eyes, heart, but they are unaware about the musculoskeletal complications of diabetes. So over to you, Dr. Rakesh Sahai.
Good morning to all of you. It's a pleasure to be here at the SwasthyaCon 2021, which is a virtual conference. And today I'm going to speak to you about the musculoskeletal manifestations of diabetes. So I am Dr. Rakesh Sahai from Hyderabad. Musculoskeletal complications of diabetes are not very uncommon. They are not listed as the usual complications of diabetes, but they are not uncommon. And this is a group of complications which actually make the person with diabetes suffer with pain. And they can be, apart from pain, they can be functional impairment. It can influence the ability of the person to cope with the other aspects of treatment, that is particularly the lifestyle measures that he needs to take, the exercise and weight management issues, they become a problem. So musculoskeletal complications can be broadly divided into these three groups. I'll try to cover some of these important ones which are seen commonly. They could be the fibroproliferative disorders of soft tissue like the chiroarthropathy, the frozen shoulder, the Dupuytren's contracture, the tenosynovitis of the fingers, which is called the trigger finger, and carpal tunnel syndromes. And then there could be disorders of joint tissue, particularly with Charcot's joints and gout, osteoarthritis, and there could be disorders of bone like the diffuse idiopathic skeletal hyperostosis. And also osteoporosis also is a major problem which is common in patients with diabetes. I'm not going to discuss about that, and also disturbances in fracture healing. So I'll not discuss that aspect, but I'll be discussing the other common aspects which are commonly seen by many of us. So if you look at the diabetic chiroarthropathy, this is a limited joint mobility which is seen in patients with diabetes. And here what we are seeing is that there are flexion contractures of the proximal interphalangeal joints and the metacarpophalangeal joints of the hands. And this is what is the characteristic feature. And the fifth proximal interphalangeal joint is the one which is affected the first. And what is basically happening here is that because of a non-enzymatic glycosylation and accumulation of collagen, there is this interference with mobility of the joints. And the skin on the dorsum of the hand typically appears tight and waxy in such people. The large joints such as the wrist, elbow, ankle, and cervical spine can also be affected in some individuals, and this can lead to reduced lung volumes also in more severe involvement. Pain is usually mild or absent in early disease, and features of synovitis such as joint swelling, effusion, warmth, and tenderness are typically absent. So such features are not there. Pain is also not there. So it's a silent condition, and it may become painful a little later in the course, but this is typically how you identify the presence of chiroarthropathy in the presence of by the presence of what is called as a prayer sign, and also what is called as also the tabletop sign, which can sometimes be used to identify that. And if you look at the prevalence of this problem, this is more commonly seen in patients with type 1 diabetes, ranging from 9 to 58% prevalence according to various studies. And in type 2 diabetes also, it's very common. It is particularly common. It's one of the earliest complications of diabetes, and it is strongly associated with the presence of microvascular complications such as retinopathy and nephropathy in type 1 diabetes, and it also correlates with the macrovascular disease in patients with type 2 diabetes. And so this is how we identify the presence of this chiroarthropathy. The mainstay of therapy remains maintaining good glycemic control And physiotherapy, particularly hand therapy, may be of benefit. That is providing exercise to the hand muscles and the hand joints. This may benefit and improve the joint contractures, and the joint function can improve with that. In very severe cases, corticosteroid injections have been used, and they may lead to resolution of the finger contractures in almost 2/3 of the cases related to joint mobility. But this is limited only to those who have very severe involvement. But otherwise, physiotherapy, hand therapy is what is very useful in such patients. Now, coming to the other common problem that we see, this can even be a marker for identifying diabetes in some people who are not known to have diabetes, but they have been having diabetes for a long time. They can present with frozen shoulder. So this is a very characteristic sign which is seen in many people. And what we see here is that there is restriction, apart from the shoulder pain, there is restriction of movement of the shoulder joint. And three phases of the disorder are well recognized. First phase is the painful freezing stage with associated nocturnal pain, which lasts about 4 to 8 months, followed by the adhesive phase with improvement in pain but severe restriction of movement, range of motions. And finally, we have the resolution phase. The mean time to resolution, if you look at the natural history, can go on up to about 30 months also. So this is how this frozen shoulder evolves. It's also called as the adhesive capsulitis of the shoulder joint. And the prevalence in patients with diabetes is to the tune of 11 to 19%. Whereas if you look at age-matched controls, the prevalence may be as low as 2 to 3%. So patients with diabetes are also more likely to have a bilateral disease. And the key risk factors for frozen shoulder in patients of diabetes are those who are older age. At older age, they have a longer duration of diabetes. Those who have had a previous myocardial infarction, retinopathy, and peripheral neuropathy. So the presence of these complications increases the risk for development of frozen shoulder in people with diabetes. Now, typically, this is a diagnosis which is made by clinical observation itself, the restriction of movement and the pain at the shoulder. These are enough to make a diagnosis. Plain radiographs are typically normal, and although the condition is usually self-limiting, some patients have persistent shoulder pain, and restricted range of motion may last for several years also if they are not starting off with good physical therapy. Imaging and histological studies have demonstrated that the pathological features of frozen shoulder are thickening of the capsule and synovium with contracted joint volume. So those are the features that are seen. We don't need to do imaging more than doing the X-ray. We probably don't get any further benefit, but it may be needed in some situations where we want to distinguish it from other conditions. There may be need for doing that, but this is what you would see: thickening of the capsule and synovium. So in the painful freezing stage which you spoke of, analgesics are the mainstay of therapy, and pain relief has to be provided. And then you have the role for intra-articular corticosteroids. It has been shown by some group of people that early use may result in better outcomes. But the mainstay of therapy, I would say, is physiotherapy with exercise, which limits within the limits of the pain, and that forms the mainstay of therapy. In the adhesive phase, more intensive physiotherapy is indicated. While in refractory cases, you could think of other forms of therapy such as radiographic guided hydrodilatation or manipulation under anesthesia, where you're trying to overcome these adhesions. And also arthroscopic release has also been done by some of the orthopedic surgeons. So these are the various forms of treatment that are required, but the mainstay of therapy, as I mentioned, is physiotherapy with good glycemic control. Maintaining glycemic control definitely improves the outcomes and also prevents the recurrence of this problem. Now coming to other problems like the Dupuytren's contracture. So Dupuytren's contracture is basically a fibroproliferative disorder of the plantar palmar fascia, leading to formation of palmar nodules, the development within the palmar aponeurosis, with tethering of the overlying skin and eventual flexion contractures, particularly affecting the ring and little fingers. So typical involvement is of the ring and little finger, as you can see in this picture, and there is formation of these nodules which can be palpated easily, and there is thickening of the skin which can be seen. And if you look at the pathogenesis of this problem, this is because of disordered fibroblast and myofibroblast function, and there is deposition of excess deposition of type 3 collagen, which is potentially mediated by growth factors such as transforming growth factor beta and basic fibroblast growth factor. So all these get activated and cause deposition of excess deposition of type 3 collagen, and there is this condition seen particularly involving the palmar aponeurosis, the 4th and 5th fingers. And diabetes is an important risk factor for dupuytren's contracture. It is present in about 26% of patients. It happens in about 26% of patients with diabetes. And if you look at within diabetes, the risk factors, if you look at people with diabetes, the age and disease duration are the major risk factors for the development of dupuytren's contraction in patients with diabetes. Other risk factors being cigarette smoking, manual labor, and alcohol consumption add to the risk. They are commonly associated with the microvascular complications in type 1 diabetes, and they are also associated with macroalbuminuria and type 2 diabetes. And here again, the treatment of choice is surgical treatment. We may have to release the contractures that are formed. The other common problem that we see is the trigger finger or what is called as a tenosynovitis. So this is a condition in which the flexor tendon is prohibited from gliding through the tendon sheath because of thickening of the synovial sheath over the tendon. So because of this, the finger remains in a flexed position. It is very difficult to extend. I mean, it can get extended, but the spontaneous extension is restricted. This disorder most frequently affects the ring finger, but can also affect the other fingers and also the thumb. The patient may report a clicking sensation when moving the finger, discomfort over the palm, or over triggering when the finger is locked in flexion. So the finger can also get locked in flexion, and sometimes it's difficult to extend it. He can extend it with his with the other hand. Using the other hand, he may be able to extend it, and you have this clicking sound which is heard when the person tries to extend the finger. Like once again, the risk factors are similar to what we have discussed for the other problems. The age of the patient, the diabetes duration, and the presence of other microvascular complications are risk factors for the development of trigger finger. And splinting and hand therapy is what is required. Corticosteroid injections again may be required in a small percentage of patients, but they have a good success rate. If conservative therapy fails, release using a percutaneous needle approach or open surgery is also indicated in some patients. Carpal tunnel syndrome is another common problem. As we all know, this is a common compressive neuropathy affecting the median nerve in the carpal tunnel. The typical presentation is paresthesias of the hand, particularly affecting the thumb, index, and middle finger. The paresthesias are more frequent at night and may wake up the patient from sleep. Wrist and hand pain may also occur, and patients frequently report hand clumsiness. So this is what we see typically, the carpal tunnel syndrome. The provocative tests, we could use tests like Fallon's test and Tinel's test may be positive. By tapping on the carpal tunnel, you could elicit tingling in the tips of the fingers. The Fallon test, if positive, is positive if paresthesias in the median nerve distribution is reported following flexion of the wrist at 90 degrees for 60 seconds. And the Tinel test, as I mentioned, is when you tap on the volar aspect of the wrist over the carpal tunnel, you find paresthesias noted at the tips of the fingers. So this is how you clinically diagnose this problem. You can even do an electrophysiological test to confirm the presence of carpal tunnel syndrome, where you would find prolonged latencies and delayed conduction velocities affecting the median nerve across the wrist. Treatment consists of maintaining the wrist in neutral position using a removable wrist splint. Splinting is particularly useful for nocturnal symptoms and is sufficient to treat a mild disease. Local corticosteroid injections provide good short-term relief. Surgical release may be required in patients who are not getting relief from the other condition, by the other measures, and it is also effective therapy. Diabetes, as we said, is the most common cause for carpal tunnel syndrome. Apart from various other infiltrative disorders like hypothyroidism, also may be a common cause for carpal tunnel syndrome. Other infiltrative disorders can also be a cause for carpal tunnel syndrome. And it is, as we have seen with other complications, it's associated with duration of diabetes, and it is correlating with the microvascular complications. One of the other problems that we see is a destruction of joint, which happens in diabetes. This is called as Charcot's joint. It's a destructive arthropathy. It most commonly affects patients with diabetes who also have a peripheral neuropathy. The disorder affects about 0.1 to 0.4% of patients with diabetes and may lead to severe foot deformity and disability, ulceration and limb amputation. The pathogenesis of Charcot's process remains poorly understood. Recent studies, however, indicate that this may be triggered in susceptible individuals by events that lead to localized inflammation in the affected foot. And this triggers off a vicious cycle in which there is increased inflammation, increased expression of receptor activation of nuclear factor kappa B, rank ligand, and increased bone breakdown. So all these may be triggered in a person who's got a susceptibility to develop Charcot's. And the development presents during the initial stages, it presents as acute inflammation with swelling, warmth, and erythema of the foot. Pain may be featured despite the presence of peripheral neuropathy, peripheral sensory neuropathy, and the peripheral pulses are usually well felt, they are bounding, and there is gradually worsening of deformities later on with bone resorption, fracture, and dislocation, leading to instability of the foot and classic rocker bottom foot dislocation of midfoot. So this is how it proceeds through a phase of acute inflammation, followed by the development of the deformities, and persistence of these deformities can be there later on. In the stage 0, the plain radiograph may appear normal early in the acute phase of the disease. Stage 1 is the stage where there is bone deformity develops. Radiograph shows severe osteolysis, bone fragmentation, and disordered architecture. There is hyperemia resolves, swelling reduces, and skin temperature normalizes. Bone debris is resolved, and bone sclerosis may occur. Stage 3 is the reconstructive stage where there is remodeling of the bone, ankylosis, and proliferation of bone and formation of a stable foot. So this is how the Charcot's foot appears, and you could see here in these X-rays, you could see the destruction of the from normal towards the more severe phase. You can see the destruction of the joint, of the subtalar joint, and there is dislocation of the Lisfranc joint. The acute phase lasts for about 2 to 6 months, and the reparative phase lasts for about 24 months. During both the acute and the reparative phase of the disease, bone deformities may lead to abnormal load bearing with ulceration of the overlying skin, and secondary osteomyelitis may also occur. There are different patterns of involvement. I'll not go into too many details of this. There are different patterns of involvement that are listed out, 5 different patterns of involvement, and the most common patterns being 2 and 3, and the combination of patterns also seen. Bilateral disease is present in 1/4 of patients, and rarely joints such as the knee, elbow, and shoulders may also be affected. But typically, the ankle joint is the one which is affected. And it has to be differentiated from osteomyelitis and inflammatory arthropathy. A unilateral swollen hot foot without an ulcer in a patient with neuropathy may be considered as Charcot foot unless proved otherwise. In patients where osteomyelitis is suspected, you can do a FDG PET scan, which has shown the highest sensitivity for distinguishing Charcot's arthropathy from osteomyelitis. The management in the acute phase, it's mainly immobilization and requires close monitoring and regular adjustment of the casts. A close contact cast has to be used. Bisphosphonates have been used. IV bisphosphonates like pamidronate, 90 milligrams per single infusion has been found to be effective in a small study. In another study, weekly alendronate, oral alendronate was also found to be equally effective in improving the pain scores, bone turnover markers, and foot bone density. Surgical management may be recommended in the reparative phase rather than in the acute phase. Now, coming to other conditions, like there is a condition called as diffuse idiopathic skeletal hyperostosis, where it's a disorder characterized by increased bone formation, particularly at the enthesis, that is the insertion of the ligaments and tendons into the bone. And ossification of the anterior longitudinal ligament of the spine occurs most commonly in the thoracic spine. Extra spinal ossification may also be identified. This prevalence is as high as 15% in women and 25% in men over the age of 50 years. So this is common in patients with diabetes. This can happen with the obesity and type 2 diabetes being risk factors for the development of diffuse idiopathic skeletal hyperostosis. High glucose levels and high insulin levels predispose it to the development of this. Dyslipidemia and hyperuricemia also are risk factors for the development of this problem. Okay, we're not going into too many details of this. The management consists of symptomatic patients, analgesic therapy, and physiotherapy are the standards for the care of this condition. and there have been no controlled trials of therapies in patients with, however, we don't have very good controlled trials. Gout is another problem. Serum urine concentrations are high, and patients with gout have high rates of metabolic syndrome and type 2 diabetes as compared to those without gout. So gout is a common accompaniment of, and it's becoming a part of the metabolic syndrome also. So acute gout requires colchicine and steroids, whereas in patients who have got hyperuricemia, lowering of urate therapy has been indicated in patients who have got recurrent flares, gouty arthropathy, tophi, or radiographic changes. Two other conditions, I'll just take half a minute more, and one is the diabetes muscle infarction. This is a rare condition which is a tumoriform focal muscular degeneration. This has been described in 1965, and then several reports have been there, and this is a acute painful swelling in the thigh muscles, mostly in the thigh muscles. Sometimes it may happen in the calf muscles also. There's a palpable mass has been reported, and this may occur over and over also again. And it is basically a reperfusion injury after muscle ischemia resulting in muscle infarction. And this commonly accompanies patients with diffuse microangiopathy, diabetes microangiopathy, thromboembolism, hypercoagulability, and vascular damage. The CPK levels may be elevated. MRI may be helpful in diagnosing this condition, where you have the typical appearance in the MRI, and very rarely people may require to do further tests, like doing a biopsy may be required in very few circumstances. But by and large, the management is supportive care, and that results in a resolution of the problem. And you have another problem, which is muscle cramps. Muscle cramps are very common in patients with diabetes. It can be because of electrolyte imbalances, hypoglycemia, or peripheral vascular disease with arterial insufficiency. It's more common in the lower extremities and happens at night. Sometimes fasciculations can also be seen because of secondary to lower motor lesions. These cramps may be confused with hypocalcemic cramps and the restless leg syndrome, and they have to be differentiated from that. So finally, I would conclude by saying that musculoskeletal complications of diabetes are not uncommon complications. Most of them are very painful. More common in patients with type 1 diabetes as compared to type 2 diabetes, and also they are related to the duration of diabetes, the presence of microvascular complications, and sometimes microvascular disease in patients with diabetes. Early recognition of these problems can help in effective management using conservative physical rehabilitation therapies. And some of them may require more severe, more intensive management with corticosteroid therapy in some of those situations, or maybe with surgical management. Thank you all for the patient hearing.
Thank you so much, sir.